I'll be using optical illusions to make the case that we don't see the world as it really is. What we see is a creative construction the nervous system makes as it summarizes and abstracts from all the visual data it receives. For example, notice the black dots at the intersection of some of the lighter lines in this figure. They exist only in your brain. There are no black dots on the screen, only white dots. On the other hand, there really are black dots at the intersections in this figure, 12 to be exact. But you can't see them all, even though you're looking right at them. So what do you make of the fact that when you look at the first image, you saw black dots that are not present on the screen? And when you looked at the second image, you didn't see black dots that actually are present on the screen. If you're not sure, let's collaborate to research your experience of these illusions. So let's you and I observe the experience of our subject, you, perceiving this image. First, slowly scan the image from the top left as if you were reading a book. And you'll notice that you can see each black dot individually. And if you go through the entire image, you'll count 12. And now you know what the researcher knows. Namely, that there's a difference between reality and your perception of reality. So for this thought experiment, I'd like you to alternate between two perspectives. The perspective of the subject, who is asked to count the dots. From this first-person perspective of the subject, you'll experience the illusion directly. And so you'll experience what it feels like to be taken in by the illusion. Now, I'd like you to shift to the perspective of my research collaborator, who is studying how the subject perceives this image. And as a cognitive scientist researching perception, you're aware that inside the subject's skull, it's dark and quiet. And all the subject knows about reality is based on a map the brain constructs from the data it receives. The next couple of illusions are so convincing that when viewed from the first-person perspective of the subject, you may feel certain that you're seeing things as they are. That, for example, these tabletops are different shapes, or that squares A and B are different shades of gray. However, when you consider the images from the researcher's perspective, you may feel certain that a different conclusion is true. As you go through these illusions, see if you can switch back and forth between the first-person perspective that is taken in by the illusion and the perspective of a dispassionate observer researching how the subject perceives visual stimuli. These tabletops appear quite different. In fact, they are identical. Here's a graphic of a similar set of tabletops with one superimposed upon the other. While it's hard to believe, squares A and B are the same shade of gray. To prove that your eyes deceive you, the figure on the right includes two uniformly gray bars, which I'll now highlight and magnify. Notice that the gray shade is uniform throughout. The researcher knows that they're the same shade, but to the subject it feels like there's a difference. And it looks different than it feels. Here's a familiar illusion of perspective that gives you the opportunity to feel what it's like to be taken in by an illusion And here's a diagram that partially illustrates how the illusion was created. So you can imagine being the researcher, arranging the stimulus in order to elicit the intended reaction from the subject. Here, from the subject's perspective, the second guy looks a lot scarier than the first guy. But from the researcher's perspective, they're the same. These optical illusions give you an opportunity to explore how your perceptual system works. And as you've seen, your interpretations depend upon your perspective. And this is not just true for the visual modality. You'd know what I mean if you ever had the experience of looking back on a regrettable action, such as hurting a loved one, or breaking a promise to control your use of a substance or an activity. In hindsight, the blunder looked foolish, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do. Other people's misinterpretations are obvious to you because you are seeing things from the dispassionate observer's perspective. But you're blind to your own misinterpretations because you're seeing things from the first-person perspective. That is, until you review them in retrospect. Working with these images gives you the opportunity to practice looking at things from different perspectives and to become familiar with the process of intentionally shifting from the first-person perspective to the dispassionate perspective of a rational observer who has unconditional positive regard for you, the one who has to respond immediately in a rapidly changing environment and live with the consequences. So consider how a photographer determines the viewer's interpretation by choosing the angle from which to take the photo. In the same manner, you can influence your reaction to the things that happen by mindfully choosing the perspective from which you interpret them. These forced perspective illusions are intended to elicit a false interpretation, to emphasize the point that manipulating your perspective can distort your interpretation of what you see. Now, it's unambiguously true that the Eiffel Tower is larger than a human hand. And so you know right away that this is an illusion, and it's not likely to take you in. But the interpretation of the events that actually happen is genuinely ambiguous. There may be many equally plausible interpretations. The reactions you experience in real time depends upon your particular interpretation of the events that happen. For example, this is an ambiguous figure that you can interpret either as an attractive woman or as flowers and a butterfly. Notice that you can passively allow your interpretation of the visual stimuli to shift back and forth on its own. Or you can intentionally choose how you interpret what you see, and thereby mindfully influence your reaction to it.